I love living things, okay? And living things go to all sorts of crazy places to adapt and survive. They're at the bottom of the ocean. There are living things in active volcanoes. Some living things go to Applebee's. But nothing has ever been nearly as fascinating to me as life underground. You might think that they could barely survive outside of the sunlight, since that's basically how they teach us about life in biology class, you know, like everything revolves around the sun. But underground or subterranean life is actually really diverse. So diverse, in fact, that basically every time we do a study anywhere in the world, we find new species that we didn't know existed before. So what kind of stuff is living underground? What kind of habitats are they found in? How do they survive? There are some incredibly cool and unbelievable organisms living underground that I'm going to tell you about. But first, let me say, geez, finding this information is so difficult. I've been reading papers of all sorts for underground life for literal weeks now, and there is an apparent lack of information. And for what information there is, it's really disconnected from each other, like the paper authors weren't even talking to each other. So it makes it really difficult. However, because I love cave life, I persevered. And this is a comprehensive guide to life below the surface. I'm going to teach you the vocabulary you need, educate you on the how and why of cave life, and show you basically all the types of underground creatures that we have found so far. Before I bore you with the how and why, let me just show you some cool stuff that lives below us to keep your attention. This is the waterfall climbing cave fish, a completely blind, colorless fish which sustains itself in cave waterfalls in Southeast Asia. And here's our first vocab word. This fish is troglomorphic. Troglomorphic animals are the ones which have physically adapted to cave life. In this case, the fish lacks eyes because you don't need them in the dark, and it lacks color because you don't really need that other. These are the most common troglomorphic features. This fish is cave obligate. That means it can't survive outside of the caves and it spends its whole life in them. Therefore, we call it a troglobite. Other animals enjoy caves and frequently live in them but are not reliant on the caves. We call these troglophiles. My favorite troglophile is the cave salamander, which is pretty poorly named since it doesn't exclusively live in caves. In fact, I took this photo on a random cliffside in Alabama of a cave salamander. You might be surprised to hear there's a third secret category of underground life, and it's my favorite. They're called stygobites. They're animals that live in our underground water. It's something most people never think of, but below ground, in those big pools of water that we use for wells and come out of springs and more, there are living things adapted to life underground. These guys are much worse studied because unlike caves, which some brave explorers can enter and document the species they come across, we have no way to swim in this underground water. I mean, it's just in the dirt. So the only time that we actually get to see these things is when they accidentally come to the surface through, say, a spring or a seep in the ground. My personal favorite stygobites are the amphipod genus Stygobromus, a genus of completely blind, colorless crustaceans, like this guy, who I found at a spring in New Jersey that originates underground. Okay, so before I show you all of the cool animals that live underground, let's address the first most obvious question. How do things survive without the sun? It seems so counter to what we learn in biology class. We know, though, that animals live in the deep sea and survive where there is no light. But many of them are sustained on nutrients that fall down like snow. They fall from above when things die. And those nutrients wouldn't do that if there wasn't sunlight above. So, although deep sea organisms do live without sunlight, they're still sustained by it. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, such as hydrothermal events, but the idea is that the sun still makes this possible. Caves are just the same. The primary food source in caves is soil, leaves, and other random decaying stuff carried in during flooding events or by running water or by wind or just by gravity. This sustains the base of the food web, and the most diverse cave critters are bugs. In more advanced caves, temporary residents of the cave might provide the food indirectly, like bats who poop in the caves and that feeds the cave. Seriously. But bats aren't what interests me. My friend Megan would be very mad at me saying that. She loves bats. But to me, nothing is cooler than true troglobites, animals that have committed 100% to being residents of the cave. Okay, enough teasing. In no particular order, this is a list of all of the things that we have found below the surface. First up, worms! I know, who cares? But these are cool, trust me. I'll go back and forth between like the crazy cool typical groups like cave fishes and these type of groups because there's a lot of them, so just bear with me. Now, earthworms, unsurprisingly, end up in caves a good bit. After all, they live in our dirt, and dirt tends to get washed into caves. But these guys are in there by accident, or at best, some species we might call troglophilic. They find their way in there because they want to be in there, but they don't live their whole life in there. Not flatworms, though. There are many stygobitic species of flatworms, also called planaria or hammerhead worms. These guys look kind of like leeches at first, but they don't be alarmed, they just kind of eat little bugs. They've got this awesome triangular head that makes their body look like it's just an arrow pointing in whatever direction they're going. And the most common genus of subterranean flatworms are the Phagocata, who have mostly lost their eyes and color. Because these guys are so adaptable and invincible, we find them in our groundwater even far outside of cave regions. That being said, stygobitic planarians have only really been studied in the US, and arguably studied pretty poorly even within the US, so there are probably hundreds of times more species out there than we currently know about. Okay, next let's talk about someone a bit higher up on the cave food chain. Cave crayfish. The majority of these guys are complete troglobites, lacking eyes or color, adapted for living in the dark. They are very diverse in North America, and we haven't even found most of them yet. You would think something of this size would be like really obvious in a cave, but they can be hiding in caves that we didn't even know existed. My favorite example of this is the Lacan exit crayfish. You might think the name is a little odd, but trust me, it makes perfect sense once you know the story. This crayfish was found when they were blasting away rock to make an exit ramp for a highway in Alabama. They did a blast of the rock and noticed an opening in the wall. Upon crawling in barely a few feet, they found a pool of water filled with this unique species of troglomorphic crayfish that lives nowhere else in the world. Thus far, this is the only location, and so they are critically endangered. How did they get there if we opened up the first hole into the cave? Well, there might be a crevice above the cave that's too small for us to notice, they fell into during a flood, or maybe the cave is connected underground to an underground stream and they permeated that way. But the point is that something even as seemingly obvious as a crayfish was hiding in a wall along a highway. Who knows how many more we haven't found yet. Next up, cave isopods. Isopods are unique in that there are both troglobitic and stygobitic isopods. Can you remember the difference? That's right, troglobites live outside of the water underground. They're on the terrain, they're terrestrial, and stygobites live in the water underground. I think the most diverse group of stygobitic isopods is Kykedotia, which contains over a dozen species of completely blind and colorless isopods that live underwater, underground. These guys are really cool, and thanks to amazing iNaturalist contributors like Cavemander and Hydrophilus, we have some really solid pictures of them. Here's my best picture of one. I'm not proud of it. These guys also seem to be among the most adaptable to underground life, being found on the far reaches of where the rest of underground life tends to range. Terrestrial isopods in caves, however, are a lot less common, which I've always found surprising. Where I grew up, we called the common ones on the surface roly-polies or pillbugs, and I know they were always in the dirt, under logs, and under rocks, so you'd think if there was a cave to enter, they'd be the first one in line. Maybe they're just poorly documented, but either way, this is the Flinders Island cave slater. It is endemic, that is only found in one place, to the northeastern island of Tasmania, which is already an island off of Australia, which is in and of itself an island. I think he's pretty cool looking. It's one of the few animals that I look at with big spikes and say, nah, he's still friendly. Okay, I am a fish biologist by trade, so let's get the fish out of the way. One way we know we're bad at documenting the little critters in the caves is how many species of cave fish we've found. Fish require a lot of nutrients to survive, a lot more than, say, an isopod, and that's why they're not that common in most caves. However, we still have found more than 200 different species of cave fish to date, and if you imagine the smaller things can inhabit more caves and are more diverse, then the bugs that these fish eat must have at least double that many species, and the bugs that those bugs eat must have double as many species as that. And yet, outside of amphipods, which we'll talk about next, I think that cavefish are the group with the most documented cave species. This points to the fact that we have a lot more discovering to do. If you want to find a new species, things humans have never seen before, you might just be better off looking in caves and groundwater rather than the deep ocean or space. So, fish. There is a wide diversity of cave fishes from different groups and families and places. It's actually impressive how many different times cave fish adapted to be in caves. You might think that all the cave fish are related and some of them adapted to be in caves and then they sort of spread out and speciated, but no. There's cave perches, cave sculpins, cave eels, cave barbs, cave gudgeons, cave loaches, cave catfishes, cave nightfishes, cave plecos, and cave whatever in the world these are. Imagine if we could study other cave organisms at the level that we've studied these. It's incredible. But guess what? That's not all. There are stygobitic fish. Yes, fish that live in underground pools of water, not necessarily connected to cave, essentially in wet dirt. Most of them are native to South Central Asia and are types of eels. Imagine a fish coming up in your drinking well. It's absurd. Okay, next up, amphipods. I'm heavily biased towards amphipods. I do just love these little guys. Amphipods are strictly stygobites from what I can tell. There aren't any terrestrial species, although land-dwelling amphipods do kinda exist outside of caves, and an old paper I found on a Hawaiian cave mentioned a genus of cave-endemic amphipod that I know is land-adapted. So maybe there's like one troglobitic amphipod, but mostly they're stygobites, and they're pretty diverse and abundant. In some studies, up to 5 different species of troglomorphic amphipods were found coming out of one spring in the ground. And in areas where we've done reasonably thorough sampling, we get range maps like this, which show a large species diversity. Cave amphipod research is also just really cool because it seems like, based on recent publications, there may have just been a breakthrough. See, like I mentioned earlier, these guys like to live underground in the water below our feet. So the only time that we actually get to sample them is when they come up to the surface, and we've always looked at springs for that. Springs are areas where water exits the ground with some flow and typically drains downstream somewhere. But recently, research has been done into hypotelmeneric ecosystems, which is probably the most difficult word to pronounce that I've dealt with in a while. I just had to retake that scene like 8 times. Basically, they're tiny seeps of water that form little pools on the surface. The conditions for them are kind of specific, but they're surprisingly common across the world, especially outside of summer. In one recent study, they looked in a pretty small area along a highway outside of Washington, D.C., and found dozens of these seeps, filled with troglomorphic species, and even described a new species. If we applied this level of scrutiny to where the groundwater comes to the surface all across the country and all across the world, we might find hundreds, if not thousands, of new species of amphipod and locales for existing species of amphipod, and that's why it's a really cool time to be into amphipods right now. But forget amphipods, on to many people's favorite group, cave salamanders. No, not this guy, the cave salamander, who's just a troglophile. Real cave salamanders, like this guy, the olm, an underground species of salamander in Europe. Or one of the many troglobitic salamanders in the US. These guys are top predators, and they require high nutrient caves under very specific conditions. So they're actually not as diverse as you might think, despite being the kind of thing that you would think would be good at living in caves. But they're a really good face of cave fauna, because most of them haven't lost their eyes or all of their color, and people tend to think salamanders are cute. So if you're trying to convince someone to protect cave life, cave salamanders are a good representative for the cause. Alright, I'm sure it's to absolutely no one's surprise that there are troglobitic spiders. Not just spiders, actually, there are troglobitic arachnids of all sorts. Spiders aren't even the most diverse, which is shocking to me, who knows spiders to love crevices and dark spaces, but something about caves isn't amazing at sustaining them, or maybe we're bad at studying them, because there are seemingly only a couple dozen species so far found of true cave obligate spiders, and they're mostly small and not even completely troglomorphic. Pseudoscorpions, on the other hand, are quite diverse in caves. If you've ever seen a pseudoscorpion before, it probably freaked you out. I know the first time I saw one, it freaked me out. They're absolutely everywhere in the world, and they look like tiny scorpions with no tail stingers. I've seen them in my house, on my deck, under rocks, everywhere. They're really common if you know how to look for them, and they're quite good at cave life, with a good number of species being found exclusively in caves, many exclusively in a singular cave. As it turns out, though, their namesake is a little bit less good at cave life, but have some crazy adapted individuals as well. True scorpions don't represent a large number of cave species, but the ones that do exist are absurd. Alacran trichimera is a scorpion adapted to living in the world's deepest caves in eastern Mexico. It quite literally lives so far underground that it has been found nearly a mile underground. Think about that. Think about the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa. It is deeper underground than the height of that building, and it's a scorpion. It's absurd. There's even more troglobitic arachnids, though. For some reason, things with 8 legs just love going underground. Harvestmen, or what some people refer to as daddy long legs, though that can also refer to cellar spiders, have a few subterranean species as well. Most are endemic to single caves, and unlike the cave spiders, these guys seem to actually lose their eyes and color for the most part. And finally, there are even a couple species of troglobitic mites. In my opinion, this is probably the group with the worst discovered species to actual species ratio. These creatures are minuscule and really difficult to study and describe because they also don't move a ton, and they love dark, damp places. So it stands to reason that although I could only find about a dozen described species of cave mites, there are probably so many more. If you have a reasonably sized cave near you, go take a picture of a mite on the wall. The results may shock you. You may just discover a new species. Okay, enough arachnids. Let's talk about stuff that jumps. One group of troglobites that really surprised me the first time I heard about it was cave planthoppers. Yeah, like the little guys that jump about on the trees and in the grass when you walk through it. Well, they like eating plant roots, and it turns out that some trees have such deep roots in Hawaii that they can even enter caves. And where there is food, there is opportunity. So multiple species of plant hopper have become completely troglomorphic and now live totally underground in the Hawaiian Islands, feeding on tree roots. But they're not the only underground hoppers. One of the most abundant groups that I haven't discussed yet are cave crickets. These guys get a little confusing because almost all species of cave crickets in the US are just troglophilic. They enjoy being in caves, but they're not necessarily adapted to caves. They like cramped, dark, damp spaces. If you live in the US, you've probably seen one of these in your basement before and been freaked out by it. There are, however, some species that are completely cave obligate, though finding them is so difficult because when you Google cave obligate crickets, Google sees cave and cricket and goes, oh, you want cave crickets. I got you. Have this giant group of species that do not, in fact, live in caves. Thanks, science. You're probably thinking at this point there cannot possibly be more types of animals in caves, and you're right. Just kidding, you're wrong. Cave snails. That's right. There are both terrestrial and aquatic snails that are complete troglobites. In the US, stygobitic snails are actually very diverse, having some of the most described species of any group, and that's with very little sampling and study. There's probably a lot more to find. My favorite is this guy, who's called the cave thorn, because my goodness, what a great name and what a cute little guy! There's also cave silverfishes. Wow, who's surprised? Not me. I never actually saw one of these until I was in my 20s, and somewhat embarrassingly, I kind of thought silverfishes were just a Minecraft thing until then. This is well into my education as a biologist, by the way, so extra embarrassing. But since they like dark indoor spaces like people's homes, it should be no surprise that there are quite a few species of troglobitic silverfishes. Similarly, there are Diplurans, also known as two-pronged bristletails, that are completely adapted to cave life. Many are single-site endemics and show all the typical troglomorphic features, such as Cook's cave bristletail. Guess what though? There's a species of bristletail called the cave bristletail, which is not a troglobite. Another point for science and Google, I guess. Well, we've talked about arachnids, which have 8 legs, and the crustaceans, some of which have 10 legs, so let's bump it up. Boom! Millipedes and Centipedes. They are both in caves. Millipedes seem to overall be more successful at cave life and have more species found, but at some point all of this data is so hard to figure out and find, and I start to doubt whether facts like this are real or just a result of bias in the studies and sampling bias. Who knows? Maybe centipedes are actually better at caves. Though I would guess that centipedes, since they move faster, they burn more energy, and they're predators, they're higher up on the food chain, so they need more nutrients in the cave. So I feel like they would do less well in low nutrient, low diverse environments. Millipedes kind of just like happily move along and eat dirt, so they're the best. They're probably great at caves. How about a cave velvet worm? Oh, I'm sorry, did you think we were done with worms? Well, we are. These guys are their whole own thing. I've never seen one in person, but I would love to. These guys are so cool looking. And the fact that one of them got blind and colorless in South Africa is so cool to me. This is just an absurd thing to encounter. I absolutely love this species. All right, how are you feeling? I've saved some of the best for last. In fact, one of the most abundant groups of underground life that I've yet to mention are beetles. Unsurprisingly, ground beetles, which are already adapted to living in the dirt and under logs on the surface. They were the best at colonizing the underground, which is not super surprising, with the genus Pseudoanthalmus boasting over 100 described species of completely troglobitic beetles. There are other species as well that evolved to live underground, like beetles that eat mold in the caves. My theory on beetles being so diverse underground is that there was a paper that was done which studied underground cave beetles and found and described these 100+ species at once. I feel like if similar studies were done on other groups of animals, they would probably find similar numbers, if not more species. But for now, as far as how many species exist of different groups, beetles are pretty high up on the list. You might have noticed that basically all of the species so far of stygobites are freshwater groups. And that makes sense. Our groundwater is freshwater, and saltwater creatures wouldn't have much of a way of getting into and adapting to our groundwater. How about on a remote Portuguese island in the middle of the Atlantic, though? That's right, there is a glowing white cave crab found in a cave on a tiny island in the Atlantic Ocean. There are other crustaceans too, though they're not abundant, such as freshwater shrimp who adapted to caves. There's the completely blind Alabama cave shrimp. And with that, we are brought to the final important group, the mother of all groups, probably the single most abundant cave creatures in the world with basically no studies done on them: springtails. Springtails are tiny bugs, most smaller than a grain of sand, who, despite having 6 legs, which is what makes insects by the way, hexapods, they actually split off from insects a really long time ago and are their own separate group. If you know me, you know that I have a fascination with springtails. I absolutely love these guys, and so you can imagine how disappointed I was to find a complete lack of thorough research on cave springtails, with just a few species named. I understand they're tiny, and they jump, so they're hard to find and catch, but these guys are probably the backbone of many cave ecosystems, the keystone species in the food web, holding the cave together. We need to learn more about them. Okay, quick amendment. While editing this video, I realized I missed one. There are cave obligate moths that were recently discovered in lava tubes in Hawaii. So Hawaii is making all sorts of crazy endemic stuff. I just wanted to throw that in there so you knew that existed. There's probably obligate moths elsewhere in the world, but I wasn't able to find a ton of research on them, so I didn't really include them up until I saw this article while editing the video. Oh, hi, it's Zach from the future again. Turns out there's also a starfish that lives in underwater, like, cave estuaries. So another stygobite that is saltwater based. Pretty cool. Something I came across while editing the video. I just keep finding new cave stuff, so I'm guessing that by the time that I release this video, it will no longer be a comprehensive guide because there's just so much stuff that I apparently didn't know about. Some ecosystems are even complex enough to have parasites that are cave exclusive. So for example, there are some worms that live exclusively on cave crayfish, or bed bugs that live exclusively on bats inside of caves, things like that. Whew. All right, that was a lot of information. And believe it or not, I left a lot of specifics out. There are many macroinvertebrates such as true flies, mayflies, dragonflies, craneflies, etc., who are troglophilic and they spend some of their time in caves. Some are even completely troglobitic, but the information and the studies on them are so poor that I can't even confidently find a described species of those things, let alone give you solid information about it. With the quite notable exception that I am adding in post of glowworms, which are the larval stage of a type of fungus gnat, and they live exclusively in caves, and they hang from the ceiling and glow. It's incredible. It's an Australian and New Zealand thing. They don't seem to exist elsewhere in the world, but it's an incredibly cool adaptation, and it's a huge tourist attraction for both of those countries to go basically into caves and see these incredible stringing things hanging from the ceiling. There's also a ton of troglophiles that aren't animals at all. You were probably wondering when I was going to talk about them. There's mosses, molds, lichens, that kind of thing. But as far as I can tell, none of them have been described as cave obligate. There are no completely troglobitic species of those kind of things. It's all invertebrates and vertebrates, but there's probably just more studies that need to be done. And that brings me to my final point of this video. If you found this video of any interest and you'd like to learn more, there's a huge opportunity for you here. This is like the frontier of naturalism right now. No matter where you live, you could probably find a brand new species within 30 minutes of your house. That's not a joke. Literally no matter where you live in the world. We've found them on islands. You could live anywhere, and within 30 minutes of your house, probably closer, you could find a new species in the groundwater, in a cave, coming out of a spring, etc. Just remember to do your research, be respectful of wildlife, and if you do want to enter a cave, you should join your local grotto, which is a caving organization, and they'll teach you how to do it safely and respectfully and take you with them. I hope this guide was interesting and opened your eyes to the world below you. I remember when I took a tree class in college, my professor said that his greatest gift, being someone who got to teach dendrology, teach about trees, was to make people not tree blind anymore. People go around the world and there are trees absolutely everywhere, and they barely think about the differences between them and the species and how diverse and amazing there are in terms of trees. And I hope that I was able to do that in terms of underground life. Not that it's something that you run into very often, but just thinking about the fact that if you look down, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of species just in the ground below you. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.